بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. اللهم أورثنا علما وفهما يا كاشف المشكلات يا عالم الخفيات، اكشف لنا الحجوب عن وجوه هذه المعاني حتى نطلع على هذه المسائل، واحفظنا من الخطأ والنسيان يا ربي، أنت الموفق وأنت على كل شيء قدير. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Alhamdulillah, we're back together after a very long break. We finished covering the lives of man. We took about a year and a half to cover that book, and we finished it right at the beginning of Ramadan, if I'm not mistaken. And we took a break from then until now, alhamdulillah. So we mentioned earlier on, way before we even finished the lives of man, that the next book we're going to cover is the work Foundations of Certitude. And this book is not published. It's actually composed of two parts. There's a poem in the beginning, followed by a commentary. And this book is, or this poem is written by Al-Abd al-Da'if, myself. And there's a story behind it that I'll tell. So between 2000, I think 2011 perhaps, or 2010 up to 2014 or 15, I can't remember exactly, I was teaching a group of children who would come together. They were homeschoolers, and they would come together twice a week for an enhanced program where they would study Arabic, memorize some Quran, and learn Islamic studies. And the oldest group, who had been homeschooled from the very beginning, they were a very special group, and they were teenagers before the advent of iPads. So that means they had an actual attention span beyond a tweet. And they wanted to study Aqida, theology or belief. So instead of teaching them a book that was already written in Arabic or a book that was in English, I decided that I would write a poem. And alhamdulillah, Allah gave me tawfiq. I wrote the poem and gave that poem to them. And as we were going through it, I would add commentary in the form of lesson plans and class notes, which eventually became the meat of a commentary on this poem that we're going to study, inshallah. That commentary hasn't been published. I reviewed it 3 or 4 times. Maybe in the course of teaching the text now, we'll go through the main points and enhance it over time, and eventually it gets published. But you are the first group after the high schoolers who are studying this text. Now, I must say, this text is not for your typical high school student. It's actually suitable for adults. And the only reason why they were able to learn it is because they were a special group. They were very, very intelligent. I wouldn't say they were the average group of teenagers or high schoolers. So they were able to grasp really higher concepts than others their age group may have grasped. The title of the book is Foundations of Certitude, a poem and commentary on Islamic beliefs. Foundations here means the usul, the roots, and certitude refers to our yaqeen. Now, in Arabic, there's a couple of words we can use for certitude. One of the words is yaqeen, to have that certainty, the clarity of knowledge. And there's levels of certitude that we learn about. The other word we can use in Arabic is jazm. Right? You say, ana ujzimu bihi. I state emphatically that I believe that thing. This is jazm. So this book is about the foundations for having that certitude about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the beliefs that are transmitted to us by the Prophet ﷺ. Today we're not going to cover the poem. We're going to give a muqaddimah, an introduction into the science that we're going to be studying, inshallah. So we have our bearings and we know where we are and where we're going. So the science that we are studying is called the science of Aqida. It has different names, as we'll learn, but the main name is Aqida. And the word Aqida in Arabic comes from the root letters Ain, Qaf, Dal. Aqada. And Aqada has the meaning of tying or knotting or binding something together. The magicians who tied knots into objects and blow on them are mentioned in the Quran in Surah Falaq. What does Allah say about them? Min sharri naffathati fil uqad. Uqad is coming from this word. So aqada is to bind, to tie, and that's where we get the word Aqida from. The word Aqida is a technical term, meaning it doesn't exist as a term in the Quran directly or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The word Aqida is never used in the Quran, nor is it ever used in the Sunnah. Nevertheless, it describes something that was taught by the Prophet ﷺ and taught by the companions and known by them. Now, Aqida pertains to our beliefs, our doctrine, our creed, what we hold to as the certainties of our faith. What do we believe in? What is the content of our iman? That is what Aqida seeks to explain. And before we get into the more technical aspects of this introduction, we want to mention why it's so important to study Aqida. The most important reason is that we're going to be asked about it on the Day of Judgment. The Prophet ﷺ has told us in the hadith about Munkar and Nakir, the two angels that will question everyone in their grave. There's a number of narrations that speak about the questioning in the grave by these two angels, Munkar and Nakir, the unknown and the unrecognizable. That's what their names mean. They come to the person, the believer, and they will ask that believer 3 questions. The first question they ask is, anyone know? Who's your Lord? Man Rabbuk? Who's your Lord? And they will ask then, what's the second question? Who is your prophet? Man Nabiyuk? And the third question is, Madinuk? What's your deen? What's your religion? Now in the hadith of Al-Bara ibn Azib, the Prophet ﷺ says that when the angels come and ask these questions, the believer will know the answer. They will give the answer correctly and say, Rabbi Allah, my Lord is Allah. My prophet is Sayyiduna Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and my deen is Islam. They will answer the questions correctly. And we talked about this in the Lives of Man class, that there's no clear proof in Revelation about the language they're going to speak, but we know we're going to understand the questions. Whether they're speaking in our native tongue or Suryani, the language of the angels, who knows? But we'll all understand the questions. And if the believer answers those questions correctly, the Prophet ﷺ says that is the meaning of the phrase in the Quran, يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ الثَّابِتِ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. That Allah makes firm those who believe with a firm statement in this life and in the next. That firm statement is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Allah makes the believer firm with that statement in this life and makes them firm with it in the hereafter, being able to answer those questions correctly. That is the interpretation given by the Prophet ﷺ regarding the questioning in the grave. Now, in the same narration of Al-Bara bin Azib, the Prophet ﷺ said that when the hypocrite is asked these questions, they will say, سَمِعْتُ النَّاسِ يَقُولُونَ شَيْئًا فَقُلْتُ. They'll say, which is a way of saying, ouch. I heard people saying something, and I said it too. But it wasn't there in the heart. This is the person who lives in a Muslim environment. They may even belong to a Muslim family, and they may parrot the words, but there's no reality behind it because it's not a conviction in the heart. It's not a certainty. And that's why we study this text titled Foundations of Certitude, the foundations of the yaqeen that we seek to enhance. So that's the reason why it's so important. Another reason why it's important is that ideas matter. When we talk about philosophies, ideologies, different groups and their ideas, well, we have to recognize that ideas matter. People often fail to realize how ideas translate into executable policies that affect people on the ground. Whatever policy you see in effect that's harmful to people, that policy that is harming people or benefiting them is coming from certain ideologies, certain ideas, coming from people who have a certain view about the nature of reality. So ideas matter. Mao Zedong in China, in communist China, killed millions and millions of people. How did they die? They died in a variety of gruesome ways. Some through famine, some through murder. But why did they die? They died because of certain ideas that were in the mind of Mao Zedong that he picked up from other influences. Same thing for Hitler, the same thing for any ideologue that creates war and destruction. The war and destruction is the byproduct of the ideas, because the ideas serve as the engine, the catalyst. They're the motivator. The actions require a motivator, and those are the ideas that fuel them. Ideas are important. So these ideas have an effect on us. And we see the effects of ideas all around us, whether it's contemporary politics, civil war, civil strife in Muslim countries, what's going on in Libya, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Yemen. These are sectarian civil conflicts that come from ideas, right? We also see how beliefs that are cooked up by academics in ivory towers and universities trickle down and affect the usage of language, the way we use words. And that then changes our way of understanding reality. And that kind of softens the ground, that prepares the ground for policies and agendas that seek to dismantle certain moral principles that we hold fast to. You know, you can think of any modern agenda that seeks to dismantle morality, and that agenda comes from certain people with certain ideas, and they want to use those ideas to change language, to change people's view of reality, so they can bring those policies into effect. So we see that in the so-called cultural wars here in the West. We see that in the cultural and spiritual norms that are fought against in the name of progressivism or liberalism or whatever. You know, Muslims increasingly embrace these kinds of ideas. So that's why Aqida is important. Now, one of the problems is that when it comes to the study of Aqida as a science, what we're endeavoring to do, a lot of people, a lot of Muslims carry on as if they are living in an insulated, protected Muslim village far away from all of these things. They act as if the basic beliefs of Islam that they learn as a child are enough to insulate them in contemporary society. And it's true. If a person is living in a very distant village 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago, they will be insulated from a lot of strange ideas. Assuming they live in a Muslim village, they hear the adhan, there's teachers, there's sheikhs, there's masajid, there's circles of learning. Even if they retain a very basic understanding, they're generally going to be safe because they're insulated. But as one author said, today the entire world is the West. people talk about East versus West, but the entire world is the West today, because the Western hegemony of ideas have spread throughout the world. And even if you're in a village in Pakistan today, and you think you're insulated from these ideologies, you're not, because as soon as you take out your phone, they're all coming into your eyes and into your heart. So people can no longer carry on as if they're living in a village and be satisfied with a very basic understanding of Islam. Allah is one, the Prophet ﷺ is his last messenger, we believe in the angels, and that's about it, without a deeper understanding of the challenges we're in. Now that doesn't mean we have to be theologians, and we're going to talk about that when we get into the principles. The idea, however, is to be aware of the time and place we're in, to be aware that we are no longer in a village where we can be protected by just having basic iman, and the iman of the ajaiz, the iman of the simple aunties who have so much yaqeen in that village that they would beat 1,000 theologians. That's useful for her, but it's not going to be useful for a person who's living in the middle of the West, where they're inundated by ideologies and competing thoughts. So we have to learn this properly. Okay, so we are attempting to study the science of Aqida. And this, as a science, has to be approached with a certain methodology. We cannot approach it in a haphazard way. And to do that, we want to look at what the science is, how do we approach it, what is its history, and what is the nature of what we're going to be learning in these months, inshallah. So, to introduce that, we talk about the 10 foundations. So when you study a text classically, whether it's a text in theology, Aqida, or fiqh, or seerah, or any science of the sciences of Islam, before you begin studying it, the teachers will always break down the 10 foundational matters that concern that science. They call these al-mabadi al-ashar. When you study fiqh, you learn these 10 foundations about the nature of fiqh. What is fiqh? What is this that we're studying? When you're studying seerah, you learn the same thing. When you study the hadith sciences, the same thing. When you study grammar, it's the same thing. And these 10 foundations give you an understanding of what it is you're trying to study, so that you're not mixing concepts up. We're not learning about law. We're not learning history. We're not learning legal theory or grammar. We are learning about theology. So we have to define it correctly. So the 10 foundations, I listed them here on the board. And these 10 foundations come from a short little poem of 2 or 3 couplets by Ibn Sabban, a great later Egyptian grammarian. He gathered these 10 foundations and described what they are. He said, إن مبادئ كل فن 10 الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة ونسبة وفضله والواضع والاسم واستمداد وحكم الشارع مسائل والبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع حاز الشرف. In this little poem, he says that you should know that the foundations of every science are 10 in number. They are, as they're listed out here, al-had, which is the definition, the mawdu', the subject matter, the thamara, the fruit, the nisbah, the relation, the virtue, the founder of that science, the name or names given to that science, the sources of that science, the ruling of the sharia, the lawgiver concerning that science. What is the ruling in sharia on learning it? And then issues, miscellanea. And then he says, some of these, out of these 10, are enough to suffice you. You don't need to know all 10. Some of them are more important than others. However, he says, وَمَنْ دَرَى الْجَمِيعَ حَازَ شَرَفًا. Whoever knows them all will attain nobility. When you know these 10 foundations, you'll know exactly what you're studying. And it will give you clarity of thought as you approach this science. Okay? So we want to talk about these 10 foundations, and that'll pretty much be the class for today. So that when we come back, we'll go straight into the text, and we'll know exactly what we're doing and where we're going, inshaAllah ta'ala. طيب. So the first thing is what? It's called the had. In Arabic, the had is the edge of something. But here it means the definition. It means a ta'rif bil mahiyya, the what is it of the subject. What is the subject we're studying? What is the definition? How do you define Aqida? Now, in definitions, it's very important that we understand definitions they have to be what we call jami' and mani', which means that when you define something, you have to mention everything that makes it what it is, while excluding anything that is not essential to it. So it's a way of saying that you have to remove things that are not from it, while including everything that makes it what it really is. So, what is the ta'rif? What is the essence? So the ulama, they say that Aqida, the study of this science, they say it's the science by which one is able to establish the principles of their faith via the establishment of their evidence and proofs. And this is same standard for every belief, whatever it may be. And to remove doubts from hearts that may occur in relation to those principles. So this definition tells us that it is the study of the principles of our faith through establishing the proofs for them and responding to doubts. This means that it is a science that pertains to removing any kind of following not based on understanding. It is based on removing blind faith and having true faith with insight. It is based on worshipping Allah Ta'ala with basira, with insight, with understanding. And this is because as Muslims, we are not ordered to just say, we believe and close our eyes. You just have to believe it. You have to have faith. You just have to trust that it's true. No, we're asked to know that it's true. Allah Ta'ala demands of us not just to say it with our mouths and to trust that it's true. Allah demands of us that we know that it's true. Allah says in the Quran, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is no deity worthy of worship but Allah Ta'ala. So when you learn this science, you are gaining that firmness and understanding, and you come to real knowledge, so that you're no longer dealing with conjecture, you're no longer dealing with any kind of guesswork, you're not moving around in darkness, just trusting that this thing is hopefully true. You know it's true. And when you study this science, it will really lift a lot of veils. Most people, when they come to the study of Aqida, they're going to come with certain ideas and understandings. And I guarantee you, everyone's going to have certain ideas that they're going to learn in this class are not entirely accurate. It kind of lifts the veils. And you start to look at reality a lot differently. When you hear things on TV, or you see things on the news, or if you watch a movie, you're going to hear things that you didn't notice before, because certain veils are removed through having the insight gained through learning Aqida. So, once you learn this, you have no more guesswork. You're not basing it off blind trust. So, that's the had, the definition of the science. The subject matter is the topic. What does the science speak about? ما يتكلم عنه هذا العلم. What does the science discuss? Well, the science of Aqida is talking about Allah Jalla Jalaluhu wa taqaddasat asma'uhu, the divine, the absolute being, God Almighty. It is talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in relation to what is rationally necessary for Him, rationally impossible with respect to Him, and rationally possible. We're going to talk about all of those categories later. This part of Aqida is called the Ilahiyat, theology. Theos is God, ology is the science of. The study of our belief in God. That's the theology. So that part of the study is answering the question, Man Rabbuk, who's your Lord? That's the theology. But we're also talking about the prophets. So that's another part of the subject we learn in Aqida. The prophets. What are the necessary qualities of prophets? What qualities are impossible with respect to the prophets? What qualities are possible with respect to the prophets? And this is called nubuwat, prophetology. And this is answering the question, Man Nabiyuk, who is your prophet? As Imam al-Tirmidhi relates the hadith about the questioning in the grave, in his narration, the angel says, Ma kunta taqulu fi haqqi hadha ar-rajul. What did you used to say about this man? So that is the study of what we believe regarding the prophets and messengers. And this is the second component, the second part of the subject that we're speaking about. We're not just talking about belief in Allah, we're talking about belief in the prophets and messengers and their qualities. And we seek to understand who they are and also seek to remove any misconceptions or confusions about their qualities and what is befitting for a prophet. There's a lot of weird ideas out there about the prophets and the Anbiya. There's a lot of strange ideas about the Prophet ﷺ, where people say really horrendous things about his maqam, his station. And this is the second part of the Aqeedah. The third part of the subject is about what we call transmitted beliefs. Transmitted beliefs. In other words, what do we believe about the unseen? What do we believe about angels? What do we believe about the books? What do we believe about the last day? What do we believe about the unseen realities that we have no way of accessing except through divine revelation? These are the transmitted beliefs. In Arabic we call them sam'iyat, because they're through hearing the Quran, hearing the prophetic narrations, the hadith. It's only through hearing those narrations and those verses that we understand the unseen realities of the hereafter, for instance. So there's three components in the study of Aqeedah. Ilahiyat, what we call theology. Nubuwat, prophetology, the study of the prophets and their qualities. And the third one, sam'iyat, the transmitted beliefs. The scholars distinguish between these three for a couple of reasons we'll talk about soon. That's the subject matter. What are the fruits of this science? That's the third thing we learn about when we learn the foundations. What are the benefits that we seek to gain from studying the science? What do we hope to achieve by applying ourselves in studying the science of Aqeedah? There are so many fruits that we can obtain from the study of this science. The main fruit is al-ma'rifatu billahi al-qat'iyya, having sure and sound, clear-cut knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through clear-cut proofs. Knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no greater gift. There's no greater blessing than knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's levels to that. Just studying Aqeedah doesn't mean that the person has the level of ma'rifah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or awliya, but it's where you start from. Having knowledge of Allah ta'ala is the most priceless gift one could ever receive. In Surah Al-Dhariyat, Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created mankind or jinn except to worship me. That's our purpose of existence. The reason why we are here, the reason why Allah created us in the first place. The companion of the Prophet ﷺ, Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhuma, he said, when he commented on the meaning of this verse, I have not created mankind or jinn except to worship me. Ya'budun, he said, ay ya'rifun. Meaning, I have not created mankind or jinn except to know me intimately. To worship Allah Ta'ala properly is to know Him intimately. So ma'rifah is the purpose of our existence. To know Him, to worship Him, to draw near to Him. And that is attained in part through knowing this science of Aqida. The second fruit is al-fawzu bis-sa'adat al-abadiyya. It is having or gaining eternal salvation and happiness. Gaining eternal happiness and salvation, because with sound faith, sound belief in Allah Ta'ala, the person who dies in that state will ultimately be in Jannah forever, for all eternity. Even if they face consequences for bad things they do in this life and the next. May Allah save us. But if they have the sound Aqeedah, they have belief in Allah Ta'ala, ultimately they are naji, they will be saved. They will be people of Jannah. And that is conditional on them knowing this and dying upon this. So that is why Aqeedah is so important. The third fruit is no less important for us in this life. And the third fruit is having a firm footing in establishing the commands of Allah in this life. Having a firm footing in establishing Allah's commands as we live in this life. Why? Because if you do not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your commitment to Allah Ta'ala will be weak. That is because acts of worship, the things that we do, require an internal drive. They require a catalyst. Something has to be in there that drives us and motivates us to do the things that we do. And that drive, that motivator, is our knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the study of Aqeedah is the fuel for the engine of the heart, for lack of better words. It is that way of having and developing that internal drive that motivates us in what we do. And likewise, establishing good conduct and justice based on faith. Because as we said earlier, beliefs matter. If you look at any regime or ideology, you see that whatever they're doing, good or bad, is because of ideas. So when the Aqeedah is sound, when the beliefs are sound, you have the internal motivator for the acts of worship as well as what's going on in society. And this is not to say that a person's actions are always going to be consistent with what they believe. But if they have beliefs that are at odds with what the Prophet ﷺ brought us, those ideas will lead to other things, and they will have consequences in society. So beliefs matter. Beliefs inform our law, they inform our behavior, the way that we look at reality, what some people call cognitive frames, the way you perceive everything around you. Right? So these are some of the fruits of studying Aqeedah. The fourth thing in the 10 foundations is called the nisbah. The nisbah is the relation. And by this they mean the relationship between Aqeedah as a science and other sciences. So, what is the relationship between Aqeedah and, say, fiqh, Islamic law? What is the relationship between Aqeedah and spirituality? The relationship to these is that Aqeedah is the ultimate foundation and superstructure of everything in Islam. It is the ultimate foundation of everything in Deen. And we see this in the hadith of Jibreel. The hadith of Jibreel, in which the angel Jibreel alayhi salam came in the form of a human being who had exceedingly dark hair and very white, bright clothing. he came and sat before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and sat in the tashahhud position with his knees facing the blessed knees of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, placing his hands either on his own thighs, Jibreel, or on the blessed thighs of the Prophet ﷺ. And then he asked him 3 questions. The first question was, what is Islam? Or أخبرني عن الإسلام. Inform me about Islam. Islam speaks to the only possible relationship we can have with the divine. And in the answer, Rasulullah ﷺ mentions the 5 pillars, the outward actions. The second question was, or the second request was, أخبرني عن الإيمان. Tell me about faith, Iman. And here Rasulullah ﷺ spoke about the content of our Aqida, the outline. That's the foundation. Without Aqida, without a sound belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the actions will be faulty. Without a sound Aqida, the spirituality will be corrupted. It is the superstructure to our faith. You have to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if you do not know Allah ta'ala, then who are you praying to? Who are you fasting for? Who are you doing these good deeds for? People may imagine that they are doing something for the sake of Allah, but they have a conception in their mind of who Allah is, and He is not that. So it's very dangerous. We have to know who our Lord is, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the idea is that it is not possible for a person to worship one they do not know. You have to know your Lord. So when we look at the superstructure of Islam, we know that there's faith, belief, then there's actions, and then there's conduct and the spiritual effect of these things. The ruler, the hakim, takes precedence over the hukum, the rule. The rule in fiqh, how do you pray and how do you fast and how do you make wudu? These are all ahkam. But more importantly is who is the hakim? Who is the one making these rules? Who is the one establishing this law? If we know who Allah Ta'ala is, then we're not going to really have problems with the hukum. People who wrestle with a lot of the ahkam in Islam, they don't need to be talked to about the details about the rulings per se, if they don't know who the rule giver is. If they know who the hakim is, it's much easier to then understand the wisdom behind the ahkam, the rulings. So it's a matter of priority. So that's the nisbah, the relationship between Aqida and the other sciences. It's foundational. The 5th part of this foundation, these 10 foundations, is the fadl, the virtue, the status or the rank of this science. And the ulama say that in all of the Islamic sciences, and there are 16 main Islamic sciences, out of these 16 and the others, the science of theology, of belief in Allah Ta'ala, Aqida, is ashraful ulum. It's the noblest and most superior of all of the sciences. Why? They say the reason why is because the nobility of a particular ilm, science, is proportionate to the virtue of what is known in that science. So they say, it makes a lot more sense in Arabic, فضل العلم بفضل المعلوم. The virtue of what is known is proportional to the virtue of a science is in proportion to the virtue of what is known in that science. So we're studying about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That makes the science the noblest of all sciences. Fiqh is the study of legal rulings. And there's a virtue in that. But more virtuous is the study of the lawgiver himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is the noblest of all of the sciences. طيب. So moving along, I don't want to check the time here. So the 6th part of this science, or the foundations, is the wadi', the founder. Who is the one who established this science? Man assasahu. Does anyone want to volunteer an answer here? Who founded the science of Aqida? We could ask, who founded the science of fiqh? Who founded the science of hadith? Who founded the science of usul? Anyone? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, that would be true for every science. We could say that the founder of the science of fiqh is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The founder of the science of tafsir is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the same for every other science. In that he is the ultimate source from who communicated these details. That's true from one perspective, but it's not really what we're looking at here. Because there's two ways of looking at this. The ultimate source obviously is the Prophet ﷺ, because he communicated both the content of revelation and the meaning. He communicated and conveyed the Quran in its wordings and meanings and expressions through his lived example. So yes, he communicated these things and he's the founder in that broad sense. But the science of tajweed, for instance, the science of how to recite the Quran, that didn't exist in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The science of fiqh, the science of usul, the science of hadith, the science of Arabic grammar, none of these sciences existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't have a class where they learned the verb, the subject and object, fi'l, fa', maf'ul bihi. They didn't have a class studying tajweed where they learned idgham and iqlab and ikhfa and idhar and all of these rulings. They didn't. They knew the science of tajweed intuitively because they were Arabs without prior exposure to other languages that would taint the pronunciation. So it was with a natural capacity they had that science. And fiqh as well. They learned directly from the Prophet ﷺ how to make wudu, how to fast, how to pray. They learned from him the details about estate division, matters of law. But it wasn't established as a science that's organized, that's structured, with definitions, with the details that you need to answer for complex issues that arise in the future among people who aren't living in that time. So the science is developed due to the need. So after the generation of the Sahaba, the science of grammar was developed. The early seeds of Arabic grammar were in the time of the Sahaba, but they didn't develop until later on, because there arose a need to organize the principles of the Arabic language because of all of the non-Arabs who began to embrace Islam. And they're trying to learn Arabic, but they're bringing in their own native tongue, and it's causing certain changes to the way words are pronounced. So the ulama saw it as important to lay down rules and principles and spell out the details in an organized fashion so that people can learn these things in a sound and correct way. So this is the codification of a science. That's why in fiqh, we aren't just opening the Quran and learning how to make wudu and pray. We're not just opening Sahih Bukhari and learning how to make wudu and pray. We're learning with a pre-existing structure that was developed to help us understand something that requires a great deal of mastery. And that's why we have the schools of Islamic law, the madhab al-fiqhiyah. The schools of Islamic law are organizing the content of fiqh so that we can learn it in an organized way that makes sense. Right? So if we look at the science of Aqida in the same light, we're not just looking at belief as such. We're looking at who took the content of Aqida in the Quran and the Sunnah and the rational principles and organized them in a way that could be taught to future generations and transmitted from generation to generation in a way that would preserve faith. That's the question here. Who is that founder? Well, in the earliest generations, we have imams in fiqh and tajweed We have imams in Aqida as well. And the great imams of Aqida were many in number, but due to historical reasons, they began to identify with some of the greatest among them, who really stood the tallest in organizing these principles and defending them and putting forward a really strong case for the beliefs of normative Sunni Islam, of Ahl Sunnah. So the founders of it as that kind of science are two people in particular. The first one's name is Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahmatullahi alayh. Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari is the first one. The second one is Al-Imam Abu al-Mansur al-Maturidi. So they have organized the details of our Aqida that we learn in a way that is easy to digest and process, that can be transmitted from generation to generation. And they also took the principles of Aqida from the earliest times and applied them to new challenges that arose, responding to atheists, responding to different sectarian groups that emerged, responding to all sorts of different newfangled arguments. And in so doing, they gave us the tools for responding to different challenges. So we're learning it in that structure, as organized by Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. You will not find in the history of Islam a single chain, isnad, in the Quran, going all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ and going from there until today, except that throughout the chain of transmission in the ijazah, there will be scholars who were masters of this science and ascribed to the particular methodology outlined by Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. If someone wants to throw that out, then they cannot find a single ijazah in the Quran that goes all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. And the same for the other sciences as well. So he is the founder. So, right, the second one is Abu al-Mansur al-Maturidi. Now, they both lived around the same time period. They were contemporaries of each other, but they never met each other. They didn't know of each other's existence. And this is what is so beautiful. They both arose in different locations around the same time, and they both became masters of this science and wrote many, many books responding to different challenges of their times. And when you look at their contributions and compare and contrast, you see that they come to the exact same conclusions and utilize the exact same arguments, except in about, if we're frank, 13 to 20 minor issues, 99% of which are, or I'd say 90% of which are, just semantic differences. Khilaf lafzi. It's not a substantial difference of opinion. And even those differences, they're not major issues. They're just matters of approach. They're not questions of faith, really. So they both responded at around the same time, and they come to the essentially the same conclusions. So Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Maturidi is from the lands of Uzbekistan, Transoxiana, Ma Wara al-Nahar. And his school of theology is mostly represented in the legal school of Imam Abu Hanifa, because the bulk of the scholars of the Hanafi legal school were in that region, and that is the methodology they used in approaching matters of belief. So when you go to Turkey today, for instance, or you go to India or Pakistan or Afghanistan, you're studying Hanafi fiqh when you study law. And if you study Aqida, chances are you're going to be studying textbooks written with that particular way of expressing the content of faith. Now, but on the beginner level, there's no difference at all. It's only in the higher levels of really detailed theology that you find minor differences in how they word certain discussions and certain minor differences. So this is a very quick introduction to the founders of the science. And they both are major contributors to Islam and major revivers of Islam. They were mujaddids, they were renewers of the faith. And there's no difference essentially between the two of them. Now, what's important to mention here is that names aren't that important. It doesn't matter, no one has to name themselves after anyone. What's important is the content of faith, what you actually believe. Now, going to the seventh one is the name, or the names of the science. So, who remembers what's the name of the science in Arabic? The main name. We called it Aqida, right? Well, there are many other names. We said Aqida means to bind, but it means theology, what you believe, what is bound in your heart. Other names include, what did I write on the board there? I can't see it. What's the first one after Aqida? Usul ad-Din. So Usul ad-Din means the foundations of the religion. What are the foundational beliefs that we have as Muslims? Other names include Ilm al-Kalam, the science of Kalam. Kalam means speech, but it came to be used for this science because of early controversies about the nature of divine speech. Ilm al-Kalam is one. Also, Ilm al-Tawheed, Tawheed, the science of Tawheed, divine oneness, as well as Ilm al-Sunnah, or as-Sunnah. In the earliest generations, some of the early Imams would write books such as Kitab al-Sunnah, the book of the Sunnah. And what they meant are the beliefs of Sunni Islam, of Ahl Sunnah, the Siwadul A'zam, majority of the Ummah, the belief of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. Other names include Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, the greater understanding. So you have fiqh as in Islamic law, and you also have fiqh as in deep understanding of belief. The name Al-Fiqh al-Akbar is ascribed to a book purportedly written by Imam Abu Hanifa on theology, though it's questionable whether he's the actual author. Nevertheless, the book exists and it's ascribed to him. And when you read it, it's basically a early Maturidi Aqida textbook. They're different names for the same science. Yeah. Other names for Aqida, yeah. And they say in Arabic, La mashahata fi istilah. It doesn't really matter the term you use, as long as the term is an acceptable term used in the science. There's various names. So it's Ilm al-Tawheed, Ilm al-Iman, Ilm al-Sunnah, and so on. We come now to number 8, and that is Istimdad. What are the masadir, the sources of Aqeedah? And we're going to learn this probably for the next 2 months. Just the answer to number 8. The sources of Aqeedah. It's really a question of how you know what you know. How do you know what you know? We call this, in Arabic, Wasa'ilul Ma'rifa. And in English, we have a nice $10 word for it, Epistemology. How do you know what you know? Before you study the content of Aqeedah, you actually study how do you know what you know. So how can you say you know Aqeedah until you know how you even know things? How do you know that you're correct? So the istimdad relates to the sources. Al-masadir allati tustasqa minha. The sources from which we derive our understanding of Aqeedah. Where do we get it from? Well, there's 2 broad sources. The details of that will come in the next class, next week, inshallah. The first source, of course, is revelation, Quran, and the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. This is a very broad answer. When you get into the details, it can get a little confusing, but broadly, revelation. That's the first source. The second source is the aql, the human intellect. And the human intellect is the way we understand the revelation. If we throw out the intellect, we have no way of even understanding the revelation. If someone says, leave your aql at the door, leave your intellect at the door, you won't get through the door. Because you won't have the intellect to understand how to open the door and take a step and make sense of the direction. If you don't have the human aql, you can't understand the revelation. Because revelation is revealed in language. Language requires understanding meanings. Understanding meanings requires a mind, requires intellect. So aql is a source for understanding Aqida. So we use our aql to unpack the meanings of the Aqida contained in the Quran and the Sunnah. Aql, the intellect, is a condition for being accountable. And we're going to talk about that when we get in our next class and the class after that. When we talk about how do we know what we know. This is very, very important. And the last one, or the ninth one, is hukm al-shari'. And this is a question. What is the ruling of the lawgiver concerning Aqida? What is the ruling of Allah Ta'ala as it pertains to studying this science? We know that there are 5 legal rulings in Islam. We know that a thing is either obligatory, wajib, or it is haram, unlawful, or it is makruh, disliked, or it is mustahab, liked or recommended, or 5th, mubah, it's neutral, just neutral. So these are the 5 legal rulings. In which of these 5 does the study of Aqeedah fall under? Mandatory. Wajib? Yeah. So the ulama mentioned that it's individually obligatory to know Aqeedah. But beyond that, it becomes a very detailed conversation. Because if you say it's obligatory to know this, the next question is, how much do you have to know? Because you could go on and on. It's a very deep science. At what point can you say, I have enough? What's the bare minimum of Aqeedah you have to know for the obligation to be lifted from you, for you to not be sinful for neglecting the obligation? We're going to talk about that a little later on as we go into the poem, because the poem addresses that right in the introduction. But basically, it's fard ayn, it's an individual obligation. As far as the bare minimum, well, the bare minimum is for a person to have a basic understanding in themselves, even if they can't express it verbally. And that basic understanding is as simple as a person in the desert walking and noticing camel tracks and saying, I see the camel tracks. It indicates that there was a camel here. In a like manner, I look at the world around me. The sun, the stars, the sky, the earth, and everything. And I see change. So just as the camel tracks indicate the presence of a camel, the existence of the cosmos indicates the existence of one who created the cosmos. That's a very basic, rational understanding of who Allah Ta'ala is. That's really the bare minimum. But as I said earlier, living in the current time, you will not survive with bare minimums when it comes to this. At the same time, we don't want to give the impression that you have to be a theologian or a philosopher to say that your iman is safe. It's enough to study this text. This is a very basic text. There are other texts that are even more basic than this one that you could study. This is really a lower intermediate or upper beginner text. If someone was to study this text and know it fairly well, they would know probably more than 80% of people in among Muslims, because it's a neglected science. And we see the effects of that neglect in the things people say, in the things people do, right? people who get on TV and mock dua, right? And they say things about Allah that are completely contradictory to Islam, it's because they themselves don't have a sound knowledge. It was lacking. So if we want to give this science its due, we have to take it seriously. And it's not just for intellectuals. It's really eye-opening. It lifts the veils. And you see reality through a different lens. It's really life-changing when you study the science. Once you study Aqida at the level in this text, the world around you will not be the same. You will not see it the same. It will shatter so many assumptions you may have had about reality. And we all come into this science with certain preconceived notions. That's okay. We're going to be challenged, but it's in a positive way. Alhamdulillah. So the ruling is that it's wajib to know Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger. And how and to what extent, we're going to talk about that in more detail when we get into the text. And the last part of the 10 foundations is what are the issues it covers. And we've already talked about that. It covers belief in Allah, belief in the messengers, belief in things of the unseen. These are the various issues it covers. And the more detailed you get, the more things are covered. But on the basic level, that's what we're studying. Alhamdulillah. So this is the introduction. If you write down those 10 foundations and have some basic notes about what each of them mean, and you go over those notes, read them a few times during the week, read them before class next week. I'm going to quiz you all next week or next class on this, inshallah. You will be ready for diving into the text. And as we go through the text, I'm going to be teaching it based off of my old commentary. And I'm probably going to add stuff, enhance it in different ways, and edit significantly the soft copy that I have. And hopefully, as we finish the class, your contributions and your efforts will really go a long way in helping that text develop, so that, inshallah, after this, I'll publish it, inshallah. And you'll all get free copies, inshallah. Khair. So if there's any questions, we'll take those. This is a lot. I mean, processing more than 3 things in a list can be challenging. So as long as you have the notes and you have the recording, you may want to listen to it a couple of times to be aware of the details. And inshallah, it'll be good. Any questions?
This is the Aqida of all the Sunnis, regardless.
This is Sunni Aqida through and through. Right.
Regardless of different.
Right. So there's what we call Usul al-Aqida, the foundational beliefs that make a person a part of normative, orthodox Islam. What we call Sunni Aqida or Ahl Sunnah. And then you have Furu' al-Aqida, and these are these minor issues where there are sometimes differences of opinion, but they don't impact the foundations. So this text describes the usul, the foundations. It doesn't really go into the really detailed issues where there's a back and forth and there's some internal debate. Now the term Sunni is also a term that people compete over, so there are some contending definitions about what constitutes a Sunni Muslim. We'll see some of that, but we're not approaching it through any kind of sectarian lens. We're approaching it through the lens of what has been transmitted from the earliest times until today as normative Orthodox Islam, as really the standard by which we judge, to use the word judge, other competing claims. Yeah. And that's another reason why sometimes people shy away from the study of Aqida, because in the 90s you had the Aqida wars, people beating each other over the head metaphorically with gotcha trick questions about belief. That's not the purpose of this science. And it's not to ignite any kind of sectarian nonsense like this. It's to understand, because the deeper you understand, the more you'll know the scopes of what is a legitimate difference and what is an illegitimate difference. Any other questions? خير.
When you said the founders were being founded, Imam Ibn Hassan Ashari and
أبو الحسن. إمام أبو الحسن. أبو منصور الماتريدي. Yeah. I can write it on the board, inshallah. استمداد المصادر. I didn't put the dots. There we go. Okay.
telling about the first founded background. What was the mention the name of the area? And the second you did mention the first
Sheikh Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari is from Baghdad. From Baghdad, Iraq. And Abu al-Mansur al-Maturidi is from present-day Uzbekistan. Now the text that we'll be covering, this poem, it's in English, I think it's in iambic pentameter in the poetic meter. It's taken or inspired from an Arabic poem. The name of the Arabic poem is Al-Murshid Al-Mu'in, which is a very basic text that covers Aqida and Islamic law according to the school of Imam Malik, and basic spirituality. It's a classical text taught and studied in North Africa traditionally and memorized. That text in the section on Aqida is a distillation or a summary of another text that's in prose form called al-Barahin, the Matrix of Proofs, which is a more detailed text by Al-Imam As-Sanusi. So the original work is the al-Barahin of Imam As-Sanusi, which was then distilled and turned into a poem, summarized in Al-Murshid Al-Mu'in. The English translation is the English poem is not a translation of that, but it's organized on the same pattern. Right? The words are not translations of the text, but it's on the same structure as Al-Murshid Al-Mu'in. Sure.
Why have so many scholars chose a poem to explain subjects like we did the purification of a heart?
It's a good question. Sister Kokop asked, why do scholars use poetry so often to teach these subjects? That's because in Arabic poetry, and I suppose all poetry, you're able to pack in a lot of meaning in very few words. So you can condense the science into something very small, relatively speaking, and then you unpack it in a commentary. And then the person memorizes the poem, studies the meanings, and they know that having the poem memorized, they always have access to it in their minds and their hearts. They can always read it and unpack it. It's a tool, it's an aid for memorization and maximizing learning. And in classical studies, everything is memorized. In Mauritania, everything is in a poem form. Matalatul Qulub, the text we studied in Ramadan, from Sheikh Muhammad Maulud. He's Mauritanian. And they versify everything. To the extent that even today, there are Mauritanians who will go to France to attend medical school. They'll take the French medical textbooks, condense all the meanings, all the terms and definitions into their own Hassani Arabic dialect, write a Hassani Arabic poem, rhyming poem, that summarizes the entire medical textbook. And they memorize that and ace the exams. This is how they are. But we don't memorize that much anymore, do we? You have in Islamic sciences or in scholarship, you have two major trends. You have the trend of memorization and the trend of mastery and having wide breadth of learning and reading. Now, West Africa, they didn't have a lot of books. And the books they did have were often susceptible to damage due to the weather and the winds and bookworms and all that of the insect variety. And for this reason, they would memorize everything. It was also hard for them to get textbooks and books from the East. So what was available, they would quickly memorize so that if it got lost, it's not lost, and they memorized it. Whereas in the East, because of the availability of the written words, you do have memorization, but it's less so. So one of my teachers, Sheikh Muhammad Salim Adoud, a Mauritanian scholar, he said that he traveled to Egypt, and he was sitting with a scholar from Al-Azhar. And the scholars from Al-Azhar, they have large libraries, they have access to far more books than the Mauritanians do. So the Azhari scholar sitting with Sheikh Muhammad Salim asked him, Ya Sheikh, who is more knowledgeable? The scholars here at Al-Azhar or you all in Mauritania? Sheikh Muhammad Salim said to him, you all are more knowledgeable in the daytime, but we are more knowledgeable at night when the lights are out. The lights are out, you can't read the books. Right? And that was the approach of Imam al-Ghazali. I think we mentioned that before. He used to have a massive library and notes. And one time as he was journeying, he was attacked. His caravan was attacked by highway robbers. The highway robbers took everything they owned, including his books. As they were taking his crates of books away, he was pleading with them, do not take my knowledge, please, do not take my knowledge. And the highway robber said to him, what kind of knowledge is it that I can take away like that? He said he recognized from that experience that it was a sign from Allah Ta'ala that he should memorize everything. And so after that, he would memorize everything that he got his hands on. But you don't have to memorize this text if you don't want to. Alhamdulillah.